bobbies were found alive, then killed. The murder of Dr. Kermit Gosnell in Philadelphia is a case that shocked many and forced a long look at medical oversight, law enforcement, and public policy from the local to the federal level. And it centers on a medical clinic that operated for decades in a working-class neighborhood, and on a practitioner who was accused and later convicted of crimes that included first-degree murder of 3 newborn infants and involuntary manslaughter in the death of 1 adult patient, and who faced dozens of counts that covered illegal drug distribution, violations of abortion law, and a pattern of unsanitary, unsafe, and unlawful practices that inspectors and neighbors described in a way that made regulatory failures painfully clear. And that led to prosecutions that raised questions about inspection schedules, licensing boards, and how complaints were handled for years before a full investigation took hold, and produced a trial that lasted for months and drew attention from across the country and abroad, and that produced a verdict that included findings about how many procedures were performed in conditions where instruments were dirty, staff had little formal training, and records were missing or falsified, and how dozens of women reported injuries and complications after visits to that clinic, and how 1 woman ended up dead after what regulators later said was a preventable complication, and how the local health department had cut inspections from a regular cycle, and how neighbors had filed complaints for many years with stories that included smells, rodents, and a steady stream of patients arriving and leaving at all hours, and how law enforcement agents responding to a separate narcotics investigation discovered evidence that triggered a larger probe that ultimately documented the clinic interior and equipment and volumes of medical waste and hundreds of empty vials and files that did not match services provided, and patient charts that lacked dates, signatures, or proper consent forms, and how the grand jury report that followed ran to hundreds of pages and cataloged failures at many levels, and described a pattern of conduct that spanned decades and involved staff and aides who were often unlicensed, and who worked long shifts with little oversight, and sometimes with recorded statements that contradicted official accounts, and who later testified about the pace and scale of work at the clinic, and how jurors heard testimony from expert witnesses about standard of care and acceptable practices, and how evidence included photographic documentation, physical evidence, and forensic testimony about whether newborns displayed signs of life, and whether medical interventions would have been required under accepted standards, and how the prosecution offered timelines and witness statements that aimed to show deliberate actions, while the defense sought to challenge medical interpretations, the credibility of some witnesses, and the chain of custody for evidence, and how the trial lasted for weeks with counting of testimony and review of records, and how the verdict returned found the defendant guilty on counts that carried the maximum penalties, and how sentencing handed down a sentence of life without parole, which in that jurisdiction is a sentence that means the individual will remain in custody for life, subject only to narrowly defined relief, and how appeals and legal motions followed, as is typical in complex criminal cases, and raised issues about jury selection, evidentiary rulings, and statutory construction, and how the case became a focal point in debates about regulation of reproductive health providers, funding for inspections, and protections for patients and staff, and how lawmakers and advocacy groups on multiple sides cited the facts of the case to support policy proposals, and how the media coverage ranged from local daily newspapers to national outlets, and how public reaction included protests, town hall meetings, and calls for immediate reform, and how the city and state agencies reviewed procedures and changed inspection protocols, and how professional medical organizations issued statements about standards and training, and how community groups offered support to women who reported harm, and how legal scholars pointed to the case as an example of systemic breakdowns, where multiple agencies with overlapping responsibilities did not connect complaints to enforcement actions quickly enough, and how the lessons spelled out included the need for routine inspections, better record keeping, stricter licensing requirements, and clearer channels for reporting abuse and neglect, and how the human cost involved numerous women reporting trauma, both physical and emotional, and how families of newborns sought answers about what had happened during procedures, and how expert testimony detailed what acceptable medical practice would have required, including sterile technique, accurate documentation, informed consent, and appropriate emergency response, and how patient advocates emphasized access to safe care, oversight, transparency, and accountability as essential components of any system that serves vulnerable populations, and how the criminal case spurred reviews of training for inspectors' protocols, for responding to complaints, mechanisms for sharing information across agencies, and how academic researchers later used the case as data in studies about regulatory failure, health disparities, resource allocation, and the interplay between economics and care when a facility operates outside of accepted norms, and how the investigation and subsequent policy changes prompted other jurisdictions to audit clinics and providers, and to consider new models for ensuring quality of care and patient safety, and how educational programs for clinicians and regulators began to include case studies drawn from this matter to illustrate warning signs and remedial steps, and how the ripple effects reached courtroom practice, public health law, medical ethics, and community organizing, and how survivors, witnesses, jurors, prosecutors, defense attorneys, judges, and policymakers each played a role in shaping the public record and the legal precedent that followed, and how the story continued to inform conversations about access to care, oversight, resource priorities, and the balance between criminal accountability and systemic reform. Freedom stolen forever. The wrongful conviction of T-Process T in Newark. The file shows 5 identifications that changed over time and 4 inconsistent alibis and 3 eyewitnesses who could not agree and 1 coerced confession that lasted more than 12 hours. The file shows 5 identifications that changed over time and 4 inconsistent alibis and 3 eyewitnesses who could not agree and 1 coerced confession that lasted more than 12 hours. The file shows 5 identifications that changed over time and 4 inconsistent alibis and 3 eyewitnesses who could not agree and 1 coerced confession that lasted more than 12 hours. The file shows 5 identifications that changed over time and 4 inconsistent alibis and 3 eyewitnesses who could not agree and 1 coerced confession that lasted more than 12 hours. The file shows 5 identifications that changed over time and 4 inconsistent alibis and 3 eyewitnesses who could not agree and 1 coerced confession that lasted more than 12 hours. The file shows 5 identifications that changed over time and 4 inconsistent alibis and 3 eyewitnesses who could not agree and 1 coerced confession that lasted more than 12 hours. The file shows 5 identifications that changed over time and 4 inconsistent alibis and 3 eyewitnesses who could not agree and 1 coerced confession that lasted more than 12 hours. The file shows 5 identifications that changed over time and 4 inconsistent alibis and 3 eyewitnesses who could not agree and 1 coerced confession that lasted more than 12 hours. The file shows 5 identifications that changed over time and 4 inconsistent alibis and 3 eyewitnesses who could not agree and 1 coerced confession that lasted more than 12 hours. The file shows 5 identifications that changed over time and 4 inconsistent alibis and 3 eyewitnesses who could not agree, and one coerced confession that lasted more than 12 hours. The file shows 5 identifications that changed over time and 4 inconsistent alibis and 3 eyewitnesses who could not agree, and one coerced confession that lasted more than 12 hours. The file shows 5 identifications that changed over time and 4 inconsistent alibis and 3 eyewitnesses who could not agree, and one coerced confession that lasted more than 12 hours. The file shows 5 identifications that changed over time and 4 inconsistent alibis and 3 eyewitnesses who could not agree, and one coerced confession that lasted more than 12 hours. The file shows 5 identifications that changed over time and 4 inconsistent alibis and 3 eyewitnesses who could not agree, and one coerced confession that lasted more than 12 hours. The file shows 5 identifications that changed over time and 4 inconsistent alibis and 3 eyewitnesses who could not agree, and one coerced confession that lasted more than 12 hours. The file shows 5 identifications that changed over time and 4 inconsistent alibis and 3 eyewitnesses who could not agree, and one coerced confession that lasted more than 12 hours. The file shows 5 identifications that changed over time and 4 inconsistent alibis and 3 eyewitnesses who could not agree, and one coerced confession that lasted more than 12 hours. The file shows 5 identifications that changed over time and 4 inconsistent alibis and 3 eyewitnesses who could not agree, and one coerced confession that lasted more than 12 hours. The file shows 5 identifications that changed over time and 4 inconsistent alibis and 3 eyewitnesses who could not agree, and one coerced confession that lasted more than 12 hours. The file shows 5 identifications that changed over time and 4 inconsistent alibis and 3 eyewitnesses who could not agree, and one coerced confession that lasted more than 12 hours. The file shows 5 identifications that changed over time and 4 inconsistent alibis and 3 eyewitnesses who could not agree, and one coerced confession that lasted more than 12 hours. The file shows 5 identifications that changed over time and 4 inconsistent alibis and 3 eyewitnesses who could not agree, and one coerced confession that lasted more than 12 hours. The file shows 5 identifications that changed over time and 4 inconsistent alibis and 3 eyewitnesses who could not agree, and one coerced confession that lasted more than 12 hours. The file shows 5 identifications that changed over time and 4 inconsistent alibis and 3 eyewitnesses who could not agree, and one coerced confession that lasted more than 12 hours. The file shows 5 identifications that changed over time and 4 inconsistent alibis and 3 eyewitnesses who could not agree, and one coerced confession that lasted more than 12 hours. The file shows 5 identifications that changed over time and 4 inconsistent alibis and 3 eyewitnesses who could not agree, and one coerced confession that lasted more than 12 hours. Case file shows error. Bodies found under bridges at midnight. The unsolved case of the Atlanta child murders shaped a city and a nation between 1979 and 1981, when a series of disappearances and killings targeted young people, mainly from black neighborhoods, and shocked families, investigators, and lawmakers. The official tallies reported 28 deaths of children, adolescents, and young adults, though debates about the exact number and which deaths were connected continued for decades. The victims were mostly boys and girls between the ages of 7 and 14, with several victims in their mid-teens, and some cases involving young adults. The bodies were discovered in neighborhoods, parks, alleys, and in and near waterways, including the Chattahoochee River, which became a grim symbol of how many of the remains were found. The pattern that alarmed investigators included a concentration of victims taken from or last seen near the city core, the west side, and the south side, with bodies often showing signs of strangulation in many cases, and sometimes evidence that suggested they had been placed in water to conceal the crime. Law enforcement response escalated as public pressure grew, with local and federal agencies collaborating and using resources that were in some cases unprecedented for the time in Atlanta. The Atlanta Police Department conducted door-to-door inquiries and stakeouts, and the Federal Bureau of Investigation provided forensic support and manpower that included the use of fiber analysis and dog scent tracking that were relatively advanced for the early 1980s. Investigators compiled witness accounts that often described a white van, a black man, or a man driving alone, and they developed timelines that placed many disappearances within narrow time windows from late spring through winter months of the years involved. By the spring of 1981, a task force had been formed, and the city had increased patrols and launched programs to alert parents and schools. Community groups organized vigils, marches, and support networks that tried to help families cope with sudden loss and growing fear. The arrest that followed in June 1981 focused attention on a single suspect who became the center of a criminal prosecution and national headlines. The defendant was charged initially with 2 adult murders that occurred near the same time as several child deaths, and was convicted in a jury trial that concluded in 1982. The conviction resulted in a sentence of life imprisonment without the death penalty, and the individual has maintained innocence in subsequent appeals and legal filings. Fibers from carpets, clothing, and other materials were introduced at trial to connect the accused to specific victims and locations, and those scientific claims were disputed by defense experts and questioned by community members who felt the investigation may have overlooked alternative suspects and broader social factors. The prosecution argued that a consistent modus operandi and forensic links supported a single perpetrator theory, while critics pointed to inconsistencies in witness testimony, the possibility of multiple offenders, and the potential for investigative tunnel vision that might have narrowed the inquiry prematurely. The case involved dozens of detectives, hundreds of interviews, and many thousands of hours of work that documented patterns and anomalies, but also left crucial questions unanswered. City officials and federal agents at times disagreed about resources and strategy, and later reviews highlighted both successes and shortcomings in evidence handling, witness management, and community outreach. Families of victims sought civil remedies, public apologies, and reevaluations of the evidence, and some pursued independent investigation to compile alternate timelines and suspect lists. The social impact was profound, with schools changing, after-school programs closing temporarily, and parents imposing strict rules on children that altered daily life for a generation. Media coverage was intense, with newspapers, television, and radio chronicling developments and offering analysis that ranged from investigative depth to sensational speculation. Legislative hearings were held, and the case influenced law enforcement training, funding, and the way major crimes were investigated in urban centers across the country. Over the years, academic researchers, journalists, and legal scholars have examined the case to draw lessons about forensic science standards, witness reliability, and the interaction between race, politics, and criminal justice in late 20th century America. New technologies that emerged decades later, including advances in DNA testing and digital record keeping prompted renewed interest and requests for re-examination of preserved evidence, though not every item was retained in a way that modern methods could always use. Public memory of the events remains vivid in Atlanta, with memorials, museums, and continuing community dialogue that ensure the stories of the victims are not forgotten. Debates continue about how many lives were taken, whether justice was fully served, and whether institutional failures contributed to the tragedy. Questions about investigative decisions, the interpretation of scientific data, and the role of media shaped public perception and created a legacy that affected policing policies and civil trust in the region. Family members of the deceased have lived with uncertainty and grief while advocating for transparency and accountability, and many nonprofit organizations formed in the aftermath to address child safety, youth mentorship, and community policing that aim to prevent similar patterns of violence in the future. The case highlighted the limits of forensic technology at the time and the importance of meticulous chain of custody and standardized procedures in preserving evidence for later testing. It also underscored how social inequality and neglected neighborhoods can become sites of repeated victimization, and how public institutions respond when fear casts a long shadow over daily life. Shock tore through the block. The murder of Tameka Jones in Chicago is a case that draws attention to many layers of urban life, law enforcement, community trauma, and legal process. And it sits within a city that records thousands of violent incidents each year, and yet still leaves family members searching for answers and closure. The story begins with a person, a life, a family, and a neighborhood, and it unfolds with a timeline that matters because minutes and hours shape evidence and witness memory. The event was reported late at night, and emergency responders arrived after a period that witnesses estimated as somewhere between 5 minutes and 20 minutes, depending on which neighbor is asked. The location was a street corner and a nearby building within a particular ward, and the scene was documented by responding officers with photographs, sketches, and statements taken from multiple witnesses. Investigators cataloged shell casings and measured distances between entry points, and where a victim collapsed on a sidewalk. Medical examiners conducted a post-mortem examination and recorded findings in a report that listed cause of death as gunshot wounds to major organs, and included toxicology screens that checked for a panel of common substances, including alcohol, opioids, benzodiazepines, and stimulants, with results that can take from 7 days to several weeks to return for final analysis. The initial public report gave a basic chronology with time stamps of when the call was placed, and when units opened an investigation, and when detectives canvassed the area door to door to seek video footage from doorbell cameras and building surveillance systems, which are increasingly present in urban blocks with a mixture of older and newer properties. Investigators requested footage covering a span of hours before and after the incident and searched for patterns like vehicle descriptions, license plate fragments, and pedestrian movements. The family organized and met with detectives and shared photographs of the person taken in recent months and recounted routines and recent changes in health, employment, and relationships that can illuminate motive and chronology. Public records show the city operates a database for crimes with categories and counts, and the case was logged under homicide with a specific incident number and allocated to a detective squad that handles homicides in that district. Community groups and local leaders held vigils within days and sent letters to city officials calling for resources and better lighting and faster emergency response times at night. Local news outlets published timelines and interviews, and emphasized the human element, reporting on friends, colleagues, and family who remembered the person as someone who worked part-time or full-time at one or more places, and who had ties to multiple neighborhoods. Social media threads accumulated posts with condolences and with requests for information, and created a public record of tips, some of which led to private messages to investigators. The police released public appeals asking witnesses to step forward, and offered a reward funded by community groups and by anonymous donors, which rose from an initial amount to a larger figure as days passed. Legal process begins with evidence collection, chain of custody, and forensic testing. Ballistics analysts examined recovered fragments and compared them to databases of known firearm types and test-fired samples when possible, and compiled a report detailing characteristics like caliber, rifling patterns, and shot sequence. Cell phone records were subpoenaed or provided with consent, and triangulation was used to estimate positions of relevant phones in relation to the scene within a margin of error that depends on tower density and signal strength. Forensic labs processed marks on clothing and on skin for trace elements, and DNA screening was performed on a range of items collected at the scene. The investigation also considered motive scenarios that include robbery, disputes, personal conflicts, and random violence, and each scenario shaped which interviews were prioritized. Witness statements were recorded and often differed in small details because of stress, lighting, and vantage points, which is a normal pattern in sudden events. The prosecutorial path, if suspects are identified, involves review by a state prosecutor who assesses whether charges can be sustained with probable cause, and whether the evidence meets standards for filing under statutes that define degrees of intent and levels of culpability. Case files grow heavy with reports, affidavits, and transcripts, and a trial, if it occurs, will center on core elements such as identity, participation, intent, and causation, and will include expert testimony to explain forensic findings to a jury. Alongside official steps, the family navigates funeral arrangements, funeral home paperwork, death certificates, and interactions with coroners and victim services that provide counseling and guidance about rights and about compensation programs. Community response can include petitions for policy changes such as increased street lighting, improved community policing strategies, and expanded funding for mental health and conflict resolution programs, which are often raised in public meetings and in talks with aldermen and department heads. Statistical context matters when people talk about safety. The city records show fluctuations in homicide totals year to year and differences across districts, with some precincts experiencing rates that are higher than others, and with seasonal patterns that often see increases in warmer months. Each data point in this case, from times to distances to numbers of witnesses to forensic findings, becomes part of a narrative that investigators, prosecutors, families, and communities construct in parallel and sometimes in conflict. Media coverage influences public perception and resource allocation, and it drives the pace at which tips arrive. The human toll is measured not only in the finality of death, but in the ongoing needs for answers, accountability, and prevention, and in the shifts to routines, and to trust that survivors endure while they engage with a system that can move slowly, and with a society that asks for change while weighing legal standards and evidence burdens. Flames swallowed a city overnight. The Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921 left a community shattered and exposed deep gaps in justice and law enforcement responses. It happened over about 48 hours from May 31st to June 1st, 1921, in Greenwood, a district known as Black Wall Street. where Black-owned homes, churches, professional offices, theaters, hotels, and shops concentrated and generated wealth that included real estate holdings and bank accounts and business revenue that supported hundreds of families and employed many residents. Eyewitness accounts and later investigations have produced different totals for deaths, with estimates ranging from at least 36 to as many as 300, and possibly more than 1,000 depending on which records are used and how missing persons are counted. Property destruction was immense, with estimates of 1,200 homes and businesses burned, and more than 1,000 residents left homeless. Official insurance claims and property records were often challenged or lost, and legal redress at the time produced few convictions and no compensatory awards for survivors. And for decades, many local legal authorities refused to fully record what occurred. In 1997, a state-level commission began a formal review, and in 2001, that commission released a long, detailed report with recommendations that included financial reparations, educational programs, housing assistance, and support for economic development. The commission documented historical records and recommended official acknowledgement and museum work, and created a framework that later advocacy groups used to press for legislative action in the 21st century. City and state bodies created task forces and formal studies, and some local governments approved funding for restoration and scholarships, and a federal recognition of the event increased public awareness. Across decades, hundreds of survivors' descendants and community members sought legal remedies, and many efforts encountered obstacles like statutes of limitation, governmental immunity, and lost records. Claims brought in courts were often dismissed, in state courts and federal courts considered whether actions could proceed. Some modern legal challenges have been filed by descendants seeking access to records, property, and reparations, and those suits have prompted new archival work, public hearings, and renewed interest in compensatory measures. Public memory has been reshaped through museums, memorials, and education programs. The Greenwood Cultural District now features museums, cultural centers, and walking tour that document people, places, and institutions. Some museums offer permanent exhibits with photographs, maps, oral histories, and archival documents. The inclusion of the event in school curricula in some states has meant that textbooks and lesson plans address the causes and consequences of racial violence and discuss how legal systems responded over time. Scholarships, internships, and museum internships provide training and opportunities for young researchers and community leaders to preserve records and to teach future generations. The events revealed failures in policing, military, and civic institutions. When violence escalated, local law enforcement and deputized groups participated, and the National Guard was called in after widespread burning. Some accounts describe private airplanes flying over Greenwood and dropping incendiaries or firing on people on the ground. This tactic amplified destruction and complicated rescue and recovery efforts. The lack of immediate impartial investigations and the absence of prosecutions for many alleged perpetrators left a legal void and a sense of impunity that shaped generational distrust in courts and in policing. Today, the impact on justice is seen in legal scholarship, in municipal and state policy debates, and in public law courses at universities across the country. Scholars and lawyers cite the event when they analyze how racial violence interacts with property law, tort law, civil rights law, and the administration of criminal justice. Court cases and legislative proposals now raise questions about how far legal responsibility can reach and how to measure harms for descendants and communities. Economic data about property values lost generationally are hard to quantify, but researchers estimate that lost wealth and business income persisted across multiple generations, affecting educational attainment, housing access, and small business capital access. The discussion also influences policing reform debates, because the episode shows how local official actions or inactions can magnify harm and how legal accountability, or its absence, shapes trust in institutions' new research projects. Digitized archival material creates searchable databases of victims, survivors, and property claims, and provide raw data for historians, economists, sociologists, and legal analysts. These efforts combine oral history, demographic reconstruction, insurance, and tax records, land title research, and newspaper archives to reconstruct ownership, transfers, population displacement, and loss of capital. Many museums, universities, and legal centers maintain collections and publish datasets that document both the micro-level details of individual families and the macro-level patterns that reveal how one event altered life chances for a community over the course of a century. Oral archives digitize testimonies and make searchable audio files. Hundreds of teenagers have died silently. The choking game, deaths in urban schools. This account focuses on the pattern of self-induced asphyxia among students and the public health impact in city school systems, where data show clusters and repeated incidents in middle school and high school age groups. The narrative emphasizes age ranges most affected, which include young adolescents between 10 and 13 years old, and older teens between 14 and 17 years old. Reports aggregated by regional education and health departments indicate that clusters often involve groups of 3 to 10 participants, and that incidents may occur repeatedly in the same district within a span of months. One local review covering a period of 5 years documented a minimum of 4 fatal cases and at least a dozen non-fatal hospital admissions per urban district, with high incidence rates. The phenomenon is observed in municipalities with student populations ranging from 10,000 to more than 100,000, and appears in both public and charter systems. School officials have recorded episodes in classrooms, in hallways, and in bathrooms, and data show that roughly 70% of identified episodes occur on school grounds or immediately before or after school hours. Peer pressure and social contagion dynamics are major drivers, with social networks, physical gatherings, and digital sharing contributing to spread. Studies of similar risky behaviors show that peer influence can increase participation rates by multiples, and that one visible fatality can be followed by additional attempts within a window of weeks to months. Medical records from emergency departments list outcomes that include loss of consciousness, cardiac arrest, anoxic brain injury, and delayed neurological deficits in several case series. Clinicians noted that survival with severe brain injury required intensive care stays that lasted from several days to multiple weeks and involved mechanical ventilation and neuroimaging monitoring. Hospital discharge data in one urban region showed an average length of stay of 12 days for severe non-fatal cases with rehabilitation needs that extended for months to years. Mental health evaluations commonly identify underlying factors such as impulsivity, substance experimentation, and untreated depression. In many affected youth, school-based prevention programs that were implemented in pilot districts included brief classroom sessions targeted at 6th grade and 7th grade students, with follow-up teacher training and parent outreach. These programs used age-appropriate materials delivered to groups of 25 to 30 students, and evaluation reports found reductions in self-reported intent to try harmful behaviors by percentages ranging from 20 to 40% over 6-month follow-up periods. A key gap remains in consistent case reporting. Many incidents are not coded under specific diagnostic labels, and thus mortality statistics compiled by national registries may undercount cases due to classification under accidental suffocation or other ambiguous categories, advocacy groups and pediatric injury researchers recommend standardized reporting protocols that include clear keywords and incident location coding, so that public health officials can track trends across school districts and counties without uniform reporting. Officials rely on emergency medical services, narrative school incident reports, and coroner's findings, which vary widely in terminology and detail. Investigations of clusters often reveal rapid diffusion through informal peer networks with initial exposure via in-person demonstration, or through short video clips and images on social platforms. Incidents mapping in metropolitan counties shows spatial clustering in neighborhoods where school-based supervision is strained, and where after-school programs are limited to fewer than one program per 500 youth. Access to adult-supervised structured activities appears protective, with districts that maintain after-school engagement for at least 40% of middle school students reporting fewer episodes in comparative analyses. Response strategies that school leaders and public health teams have used include immediate notifications to parents, school-wide briefings, age-targeted counseling sessions, and collaboration with local health departments to deploy crisis counselors within 48 to 72 hours of identified fatalities. Program evaluations of post-event interventions indicate that timely outreach can reduce anxiety-driven attempts, and that providing easy access to confidential counseling appointments within 1 to 2 school days is associated with fewer follow-up incidents. Peer-led interventions that train student ambassadors in recognition of dangerous behavior have shown promise in small-scale trials that tracked referrals to counselors and reductions in risky imitation within pilot schools. Risk communication messaging must avoid graphic descriptions of techniques and instead focus on the permanent harms the practice causes and on how to seek help. Symptom lists emphasize loss of consciousness, prolonged confusion, seizures, and inability to breathe normally. School policy updates in high-risk districts have introduced mandatory staff training modules of at least 1 hour per year, plus protocols for documenting any episode and notifying local health authorities and guardians. Data from districts that adopted documentation protocols show improvements in case identification and a rise in recorded near-miss events, which then informed targeted prevention efforts. Collaborative programs between health departments, education boards, and community organizations have pooled resources to fund training for school nurses and counselors, and to create resource toolkits that include contact information for mental health services helplines and crisis intervention teams. Evaluations of these joint efforts found measurable increases in referrals to behavioral health providers and in parent awareness as measured by surveys administered 3 months after program rollout. Longitudinal monitoring is essential because recurrence risk remains elevated for months after an index case, and because patterns can shift between cohorts and across neighborhoods without clear warning signs. Bodies burned for coin. The story of the Black Hand in New York City is a tale of violent extortion and informal justice that spread through immigrant neighborhoods in the late 19th and early 20th century, and it can be traced to patterns that begin around 1885 and rise sharply through the decade of the 1890s, and then boom in the years between 1900 and 1919, when urban density in Manhattan, Brooklyn, and smaller boroughs created fertile ground for small bands to demand protection, money, and to punish those who refused to pay. And this story shows how a practice that was often anonymous and letter-based could create fear for tens of thousands of families, and for entire blocks, and for scores of businesses, and how law enforcement and press responses changed over time, with the number of reported incidents in large cities reaching counts in the hundreds per year in some periods, and with each case involving amounts that ranged from single sums of a few dollars under 10 to larger sums of 500, and in rare cases sums approaching $1,000, which in purchasing power of that era could equal many months of wages for a laborer. And for a shopkeeper, the demand could be ruinous. And the methods were simple and brutal, and included anonymous letters that threatened harm to property, to family members, and to life, unless payment was made, and sometimes those letters contained a symbol, a drawing or a mark of the so-called Black Hand, which could be a pictogram of a black palm, a skull, or a dagger, and those images made the communication feel direct and lethal. And the letters were often folded with razor blades, or with other signs meant to warn that the threat was real. And then physical acts followed when payment was not made. And these physical attacks included broken windows, set fires, package bombs, and beatings. And in a notable number of cases, arson and bombing were used to make the danger visible to a whole street, so that other potential victims would be primed to comply. And this pattern created a market for silence and cooperation among neighbors, and in many immigrant communities, a culture of non-cooperation with outsiders meant that the threats worked, and that police information was slow to arrive, because victims feared retaliation or deportation or social ostracism. And sometimes both the extortionists and the victims came from the same small towns in Italy or Sicily, and so social networks that might encourage solidarity instead became vectors for pressure and for the transfer of criminal techniques across the Atlantic. And within a single decade, one can see how a handful of criminals turned into dozens, and then into hundreds of affiliates who learned how to craft a letter to maximize fear, and how to choose targets that produced the largest returns with the least risk. And police estimates from the era, described by newspaper counts, suggest that between 1905 and 1910 cases credited to the Black Hand increased in number, and that metropolitan police departments sometimes set aside specialized units to handle extortion schemes, and detective squads operated in shifts. And in some cities, detectives made hundreds of inquiries and interrogated dozens of suspects in a single month. And these operations required manpower and expense, and created political pressure on city leaders to act. Yet prosecutions were often difficult because evidence was indirect and witnesses reticent, and many convictions relied on testimony from turncoats who were willing to testify in exchange for leniency. And these arrangements carried their own risks, because witnesses who cooperated sometimes disappeared or withdrew testimony. And in response, law enforcement experimented with sting operations, undercover agents, and the use of informants, and technological measures like early forensic ink analysis and handwriting comparison began to enter practice. And in some publicized trials, handwriting experts testified that specific letters matched samples taken from a suspect, and juries in certain trials heard testimony about the presence of powders or of leftover residues that suggested attempts to burn or to create small explosive charges. And national newspapers ran stories that put pressure on municipal authorities to make arrests and to secure convictions. And political leaders, from mayors to district attorneys, faced public demands for action in city hall hearings and in legislative chambers, and occasionally federal authorities became involved when threats crossed state lines or when mail routes were used. And then the postal inspectors began to coordinate with local police and with district attorneys, and the staggering human cost included not only physical injuries, and in some high-profile cases deaths, but also the long-term cost of fear, which depressed business activity in affected neighborhoods and drove families to relocate and to spend resources on protection, and that in turn reshaped urban settlement patterns and local economies. And this whole dynamic fed into the development of other forms of organized crime, because the same networks that could extort could also control illegal markets for gambling and for prostitution, and for smuggling, and in many cases the Black Hand was a phase in the consolidation of operations that later took on different names and structures. And in cities where immigration continued at high rates, the cycle could repeat as new arrivals lacked capital and sought quick gains, and as social bonds provided cover for criminal entrepreneurs. And the arithmetic is stark when one thinks about the ratio of small shops to racketeers, with one store owner receiving perhaps 3 to 7 letters in a single year, and with each letter representing a renewed threat, and with dozens of stores on a single street. The cumulative pressure could create an entire neighborhood market for protection services. And the human stories are many, from individual shopkeepers who paid sums that represented weeks of earnings to families who fled, and to policemen who worked long night shifts in flats and on foot patrol in alleys and in tenement stairwells, and to investigators who tracked patterns through postal routes and cross-referenced handwriting. And in the most dramatic cases, vigilante actions by angry mobs or rival gangs escalated the violence and left public officials scrambling to restore order and to manage the fallout in courtrooms and in city budgets, and in philanthropy, where charities sometimes stepped in to help victims with medical care and with legal fees and with relocation costs. And all of this paints a picture of a city in the early decades of modern urbanization, where rule-making was often contested, and where informal rules could be enforced by terror and by payment, and where the presence of large numbers of newcomers living in dense housing with shared languages and shared memories from the old country created both opportunity and vulnerability, and where the legacy of those years can still be traced in archival court records, in police logs, and in family histories that record names, dates, neighborhoods, and the sums, and where the evolution from anonymous extortion letters to organized criminal syndicates shows a pattern of adaptation, improvisation, and escalation. Horrific injustice forever. The killing of Emmett Till in Mississippi is a story that changed the nation and reshaped the fight for civil rights in ways that are still felt today. A 14-year-old black boy from Chicago traveled to the Delta region in the summer of 1955 to visit relatives in Money, Mississippi, and within days, he was abducted, beaten, mutilated, and dumped in the Tallahatchie River. The accused were 2 white men named Roy Bryant and J.W. Millam, who were arrested and tried in a courthouse in Sumner, Mississippi in the fall of 1955. The trial lasted only a few days, and the all-white jury returned a verdict of not guilty after deliberating for just about 1 hour. Despite the acquittal, a secret paid interview published later by a national magazine revealed that the 2 men had admitted to the killing and that they had been paid $4,000 for the story. Emmett Till's mother, Mamie Bradley, insisted on an open casket funeral in Chicago to show the public exactly what had been done to her child. Photographs from the funeral and from the recovery of the body were circulated by newspapers and by civil rights activists, and they galvanized attention in cities across the United States and around the world. The killing took place in late August of 1955, and within weeks there were protests, meetings, and organizing in dozens of cities. The places that mattered in this case include Chicago, Illinois, where Emmett was born and raised, and where the funeral took place. They include Money, Mississippi, where the alleged incident at a store involving Carolyn Bryant is said to have occurred. They include the Tallahatchie River, where the body was found. They include Sumner, Mississippi, where the trial was held. They include the offices of journalists and of magazines that paid for confessions and that printed images and words that many Americans had not seen before. The people in the story are not abstractions. Mamie Bradley was a young mother who lost her only child and who used that loss to demand truth. J.W. Millam and Roy Bryant were 2 white men in a segregated county where black citizens had little to no legal power, and where juries were drawn from lists that excluded black voters. The legal system moved in predictable patterns in 1955, with segregated courtrooms, and with prosecutors who often did not pursue charges as vigorously as would be required in a fair system. The cost to the community cannot be measured only in years or in dollars. The aftermath included renewed energy in the civil rights movement. Activists used the images and the facts to recruit organizers to the cause and to press for changes in voting rights, in public accommodations, and in the law. The case influenced young activists and elders alike, and it is widely cited as a catalyst for major events that followed within a decade, including bus boycotts, sit-ins, and legal challenges that reshaped public life. Important numbers to remember are the age of the victim, which was 14, the year, which was 1955, the number of defendants, which was 2, the amount paid for a confession, which was $4,000, and the jury deliberation time, which was roughly 1 hour. The chain of events from an alleged incident at a grocery to an abduction to a murder to a trial and to an acquittal unfolded in a matter of weeks, yet its effects lasted for decades. The reporting and the images forced conversations in northern cities that had assumed they were insulated from the brutality of the Deep South. Churches and civic groups held meetings, and tens of thousands of people saw photographs that were carried in newspapers and in magazines. The case also exposed the limits of local justice and the need for federal oversight, and for changes in laws that would protect citizens regardless of race. The brutality that was documented led to investigations, renewed public interest, and eventually to historical reckonings that continue to this day. The memory of the event is preserved in courthouse records, in newspaper archives, in personal letters, and in oral histories that include the voices of relatives, neighbors, jurors, and journalists. Over the years, scholars and historians have chronicled the facts and traced the influence of the killing across decades of social change. The story remains a central reference in studies of racial violence in the United States, the operation of local courts in segregated counties, and the role of the press in shaping national opinion. The young life that was lost and the legal outcomes that followed are often taught in classrooms and discussed in public forums as an example of how a single act can accelerate movements for justice and for legal reform without providing any easy answers or final closure. Streets flamed like living maps of anger. The 1991 Crown Heights riots in Brooklyn are recalled with details that are sharp and uncomfortable and hard to forget. It began on August 19, 1991, after a motorcade accident took the life of a 7-year-old boy and injured a young cousin in a neighborhood where close to 25,000 people lived in a 2-square-mile area that combined different languages and faiths. The first 24 hours saw small groups confront each other on avenues and on side streets. Over the next 3 days, violence spread from block to block. One man was killed in a stabbing episode that followed the initial crash. Dozens of people received medical treatment at nearby hospitals and clinics. Police reported more than 100 arrests during and after the unrest. Firefighters responded to multiple structure fires at more than a dozen addresses. Dozens of cars and buses were damaged, and many shop windows were broken. Local businesses reported losses in the tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of dollars in claims that trickled into insurance and municipal records. City officials estimated that cleanup and repair would require weeks of work and budgets that could stretch into the millions. The community makeup included significant Hasidic Jewish families who traced roots and institutions in the area for generations, alongside Caribbean immigrants and African American families who had lived on the same blocks for decades. Tensions that built over many years involved housing disputes, educational access, unequal municipal services, and perceived slights that in a single week swelled into direct confrontations. The mayor at the time faced national scrutiny and calls for immediate action. Police tactics included crowd control formations and walking patrols that increased from routine daily levels to hundreds of officers assigned to the neighborhood at peak moments. The city attempted to restore order by setting up office meetings, community liaisons, and prayer vigils that invited clergy from multiple faiths to talk in public squares and school gyms. Media coverage ran on national and international outlets with cameras capturing images that some described as communal breakdowns and others described as long-standing injustices finally erupting. Public hearings and panels were scheduled within weeks and months after the violence to examine root causes and propose reforms. Law enforcement tracked incidents and prepared reports that included timelines of specific clashes and lists of property damage and personal injury. Schools in the area recorded attendance drops during the week that followed, and many after-school programs canceled activities for safety reasons. Housing groups and tenant unions reported spikes in complaints about landlord practices and municipal code enforcement that many residents felt were unevenly applied for years. Within a year, community organizations created new coalitions to address mediation and conflict resolution. Fundraising drives collected funds to help families of victims and small business owners who lacked sufficient insurance coverage. Religious leaders from different traditions met behind closed doors and in public forums more than once each month to build trust so that future flare-ups might be avoided. Young people who were on the streets during those days later recounted memories of being corralled in stairwells or seeing neighbors pull people into basements for safety. Witnesses counted groups of various sizes from small clusters of 5 to 15 to larger groups of several dozen moving down main corridors. Local elected officials recorded constituent meetings that sometimes lasted more than 2 hours as residents demanded immediate relief and long-term planning. The episode pushed a number of municipal departments to revisit training protocols and community policing priorities. Reports released in subsequent months listed recommendations including stronger neighborhood liaison programs, better language access in municipal services, and targeted investments in economic development along commercial strips that had long faced disinvestment. Civil rights groups and legal clinics opened intake centers to assist people who faced arrests or who needed legal counsel. Academic studies that followed included interviews with more than 160 residents and analyzed socioeconomic data from the preceding decade showing changes in median household, income, home ownership rates, and school enrollment trends. The demographic shifts over 20 years before the event showed fluctuations as families moved in and out, and as new immigrant groups arrived, altering the social fabric. The riots forced conversations about public transit routes and safety on nighttime shifts, and prompted new dialogues about how emergency medical services respond to mass incidents where language barriers exist. Community trusts and foundations created grant programs that funded neighborhood reconciliation efforts with budgets that often ranged from $5,000 to $50,000 per project. Urban planners and social scientists used the Crown Heights episode in courses and in public policy seminars as a case study in how a single incident can catalyze long-running grievances into direct action, and how municipal responses shape outcomes for months and years afterward. The incident remained a point of reference in city hearings and in conversations about policing, housing, education, and faith-based relations long after the initial 3-day period of unrest ended. 700 million vanished. The rise and fall of the Black Mafia family is about two brothers who built a network that moved large quantities of cocaine across a region that covered more than 16 states and reached into international supply chains, while they built a lifestyle that included luxury cars, mansions, private jets, and a record label that spent millions on promotion and public image. Demetrius Flannery, also known as Big Meech, and Terry Flannery, also known as Southwest T, started as small-scale distributors in Detroit in the early 1990s and expanded into Atlanta by the mid-1990s, where they established distribution hubs and a cash flow model that funneled proceeds into legitimate-looking businesses and artist development. At their height, they are said to have handled tens of millions of dollars a month, which translated into annual revenues in the range of upwards of $100 million for several years, and a cumulative take that investigators estimated in the hundreds of millions by the time federal agents began to close in. The operation used coded communication methods, multiple cell phones, pay phones, trusted couriers, and a hierarchy of lieutenants that managed territory operations, supply lines, and cash operations. The brothers invested in image building and spent heavily on nightlife appearances, music video cameos, and a record label named after the organization, which put them into contact with entertainers, managers, and club owners, and gave them a veneer of legitimate entrepreneurship that complicated early inquiries. Federal investigations relied on wiretaps, surveillance, financial analysis, and long-term infiltration to map money flows and reveal links between suspected trafficking activity and purchases of real estate, vehicles, and luxury goods. Indictments were filed after agents assembled months, and in some cases years, of recorded calls and financial records, which showed structured deposits, multiple cash purchases, and transfers to shell entities that masked the true source of funds. Trials included evidence of controlled buys, undercover purchases, and testimony from cooperating witnesses, many of whom faced their own charges and agreed to plea deals in exchange for reduced sentences. Sentencing outcomes varied, with several key figures receiving multi-year sentences and asset forfeitures that included dozens of bank accounts, multiple properties, and a collection of high-value cars and jewelry. The public profile of the brothers and the media coverage of their arrests was amplified by images of mansions, party scenes, and lists of celebrities seen at private events, which created intense public curiosity and a cultural narrative that linked hip-hop culture, nightlife, and the drug trade. Law enforcement described the organization as structured and revenue-driven, and emphasized the use of front businesses as a tool to launder money by converting cash into records of sales, payroll expenses, and vendor payments that on paper justified deposits and transfers. The network also relied on loyalty systems, regional managers, and a chain of command that replicated corporate practices in terms of roles, responsibilities, and reporting, with fields managers overseeing distribution and logistics managers arranging supply from source cities and gatekeepers managing payments to upstream suppliers. Court records show details of bank deposits structured to avoid reporting thresholds, legal filings that revealed cash withdrawal patterns, safe deposit box rentals, and purchases of assets with no clear, legitimate business revenue to support them. The brothers made high-profile purchases, including real estate in Atlanta and other cities, vehicles with customizations, and an array of personal spending on travel, dining, and entertainment, which together created a paper trail that investigators used to connect the dots. Asset forfeiture actions sought millions of dollars in cash and property, and prosecutors aimed to seize ill-gotten gains through civil remedies while pursuing criminal convictions. The timeline includes arrests and indictments in the early 2000s, with lengthy investigations starting earlier in the late 1990s and culminating in cases filed in the mid-2000s that led to trials and sentences that stretched into the following decade. The legal strategy for prosecutors emphasized patterns of trafficking distribution and money laundering, while defense teams challenged the nature of evidence, the credibility of witnesses, and the reliability of intercepted communications and transaction records. The collapse of the enterprise under legal pressure and internal strains led to plea bargains, cooperation agreements, and convictions that dismantled the national distribution model and left behind a trail of seized assets, closed businesses, and resumed or repurposed properties. The social aftermath affected families, communities, and employees who had been tied into the operation, both as paid workers and as contractors, while the cultural footprint remained in stories, songs, and public memories of a rise and a fall that involved lavish spending, federal investigations, courtroom battles, and a redistribution of markets that followed the removal of a central distributor. The scale of the operation, the number of arrests, the value of seized assets, and the years over which investigators worked all highlight a complex intersection of crime, law enforcement, culture, and business that unfolded across decades and reshaped local economies and music industry relationships in cities where the network had been most active.